Well, I'm going to start out by queuing up our tape here.
Okay.
Okay, so this is Jennifer Paustenbaugh, and it is Friday, February 20th, 2009. I'm here in the Angie DeBow room of the OSU Library, and I'm with Bellamy Parks Jansen, who is a botanical illustrator and artist, and she is a guest on our campus today. And we're going to talk a little bit more about her and about her work. So I just have some questions to
Okay.
help facilitate this conversation. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, like where you were born, where you grew up, and where you went to school?
Sure. Born in Fort Collins, 1961, March 20th. And background. Well, my father was still in veterinary school at Fort Collins. So the year I was born, he was graduating. So they basically picked me up, newborn baby, and moved to Ogallala. And he went into partnership with another veterinarian there. And he began, establishing himself so that he could get a private practice, which he did. And so I grew up in Ogallala.
And that's Nebraska,
right.
Western Nebraska.
Western Nebraska, yeah. Really close to Colorado, too. Actually, it's like within 30 miles. It's right in the cut of the Panhandle.
Okay.
And you just drive right into there. There's Ogallala. It's on the south side of the Sandhills, I guess would be the way to describe them. So he had most of his practice there. So growing up, I was exposed to cattle, horses, pigs constantly. He would put me in the seat of his truck, and I would ride with him out to ranches and farms and watch him treat animals, because he didn't want to do small animal veterinary work. He wanted to do large. So that's what I was exposed to. And it was a bizarre way to grow up, because even though I was living in town, I had at least 50% of my life exposure out in the country. So I didn't fit in with the townies, as the country kids called them, and I didn't fit in with the country kids, as the townies called them. So it was just an interesting sort of a cross section of being in both worlds. So in a way, I liked it because it allowed me to see, two different ways of living a life. Let's see.
Well, I guess, my next question is, at what age did you discover that you had artistic talent?
Oh, immediately. I mean, one of my first memories, when you want a child to become expressive and you hand them crayons or markers and paper and whatever, I did the same thing with my kids. I distinctly remember being very, very young and mom giving me a box of crayons and papers and me just coloring and literally getting lost in the idea that you could create. And from that moment, I wanted to be an artist, and it never changed. You know how kids go through periods where they're exploring? I never changed, ever. I always knew that I was supposed to be an artist, which is kind of an odd, people. And my father actually tried to dissuade me for years. Oh, you can't be an artist because they only make money when they're dead. Everybody makes money off of them, and you don't really actually make anything. And when you're dead, and I just would not be dissuaded, because I knew that I had ability and I knew that I needed to do it. So I did pursue it. He tried really hard. I mean, he dragged me into the sandhills and introduced me to trees and plants and grass and, just anything to get me outside of that little focused point. And it did. It expanded it, but it never took away the desire to continue with art, even through high school. So gradually I did develop a passion for science, but it wasn't the initial passion. Years of him constantly trying to wear me down, to get me to focus on something else, until the passion for science became as high as the passion for art. And then it created dichotomy, because as soon as I got to school, I had a really wonderful high school art teacher. He could see that I had ability. So he focused in on me, and I always thought, well, that's kind of not fair to the other students, but it wasn't like I didn't appreciate it, because he saw talent. So he would give me extra projects when the other kids were doing what was required, and he would make time for me after school to teach me special things, which was marvelous. And he helped me actually put together a slide portfolio to submit to colleges, and because of what he did for me, I ended up with a full tuition scholarship, because I wouldn't have known how to do that. Because my father's at home going, no, not art, So there wouldn't have been support there for that endeavor. It would have, so here's my art teacher going, oh, we got to get her focused. She's got ability. And so we send off the slide presentation to Shadron, and they were, oh yeah, let's get this person here. So I started at Shadron with this major in art and a full tuition scholarship, but it was not quite the right fit for me. And I started taking biology classes, and I met the botany professor, Dr. Ron Whedon, and he was funny. I mean, he spoke in ways that I had seen some of the hired hands speak in, a little bit blue in the classroom. And in a curious sort of way, it charmed me. So he got me hooked into botany. Plus, he was a very dynamic teacher. He was good. I was engaged immediately. And as a result, I started really enjoying botany. And I thought, oh, this is more fun intellectually. It's more stimulating than what I was getting from the coursework in art. So I decided I'll switch to a biology major. And of course, as soon as I switched to a biology major, I'm not creating art anymore. So the creative side of me is kind of going, so this basic, almost 50-50 dichotomy, the only way I resolved it was after the second year of school. I'd completed 4 semesters, just back and forth, just couldn't get this dichotomy resolved. And Ron told me, he'd been watching me. He struggled with this because he knew I wanted to do the artwork, and he was trying to keep me in the science building. And so he finally said, why don't you just be an illustrator? And he started showing me books with pictures, and I was like,
idea hadn't really
well, no, because when you look at the curriculum, you don't have any crossover between life sciences and art. I mean, there's just no crossover at all. Even the humanities are different. It's like if you do this, you end up having almost 2 completely separate bodies of work because cross-qualifying. And so, plus, if you spend any time with artists as a group, they're pretty, let's go with the flow. They're not rigid thinkers. They don't think scientifically. They don't. Some of them do. I mean, I'm speaking in very general terms. And then the science people, it's what you can prove. What can you hypothesize? What can you theorize? What can you demonstrate? And let's explore down to the nth degree whatever it is we're looking at. In this case, for me, it would have been cellular botany, looking at plant tissues on a cellular level. And so that appealed to my nature in terms of my meticulousness, wanting to get in and really look at things and understand how it works. But you don't get that in art. In art, a lot of the professors, I craved instruction. And the basic, and I don't know if it was just some sort of fad in the art world at the time that I took it, but they would basically say, okay, here's the list of requirements, here's the media we want you to use, here's the paper we want you to use, now go do it. And it really wasn't, I wanted to learn how to use the medium. If I'm taking oils, I want them to show me, okay, this is the level that you mix the oil with this much solvent to get this kind of surface or this kind of technique. Or, there was no instruction. It was mostly just, here's the supplies, here's the list of requirements, here's the models, here, sometimes they wanted you to do still lifes, and they'd set up a still life in the room. And then I guess the theory was, and I came to disagree with it as an artist, that you'll develop your own style. But if you don't know how to use the medium that you're working in, if you don't know what it can do, its limitations and its flexibilities, you're going to be fighting with the medium the whole time. You're not going to be being able to create what you visualize because you're not being taught how to do that with the paint. So it was my frustration with the art community that it was so hands-off. I always thought, well, gee, they're getting paid for doing basically nothing. And it was very frustrating because as someone who really gets into structure and technique, as far as how to approach something so that you can do as well at it, or be as accomplished with it as you can, that was aggravating to the last to me, to pay that kind of money and get no instruction. And I think there are still some artists in academia that still approach that way. But I actually disagree. I think the beginning students should be given instruction in how to use the medium and then told, these are the requirements. Now, we want you to use it this way. Now go create something. To both master the technique of the medium itself and to master your own style. I don't think that they should be mutually exclusive. So that's basically, why I kept switching back and forth. But Ron Whedon actually created a course for me when he realized that I wanted to do botanical illustration, or at least I was interested enough to pursue it. So he actually went to the college administration and asked them if I could qualify by doing X number of botanical illustrations for credit. And they okayed it. They gave me 1 hour, and Ron looked at the level of work involved with botanicals and decided that 20 illustrations would be a qualifier for 1 hour, provided they were different species. You can't do all grass or all trees, or, if you're going to do this, you need to have a range because you need to learn to draw all of it. So that was the initial thing. And he really was passionate. He really did spend the time to get me to develop this up. He had been doing the same thing for years too. And I think when he found someone that could do something that he had seen in books but never had a student, that it gave him an additional, oh, this is something different. Let's see what we can do with this, So yeah, it was an interesting experience, but he could only take it so far. Shadron only has a certain amount of curriculum that they can teach, and the professors have to multitask. When I was there, Ron was teaching all of the botany courses, taxonomy, botany, and any course related to plants. In addition, he was also doing microbiology and all the labs, and so it was like they were really working hard for their pay. And I never felt slighted. I mean, I think I got a pretty good education. But the curriculum was extremely limited. They had 4 biology professors in the whole science building for everything. That included pre-med and everything. So at the end of 4 years, I was like, well, I really want to get into this deeper. I want to take plant anatomy. I want to take, more advanced taxonomy. I want to get into a much deeper understanding of the plants so that I can do a better illustration. So I just picked up and went down to the University of Nebraska and got the card catalog or the course catalog out and just started thumbing through going, I want to take this and this and this. Pretty soon what turned into a course augmentation turned into 3.5 years of, it was almost like, a treasure chest having that catalog in front of you. Learning is so much fun that you just like, okay, I can just do another year of loans and another year of loans. But ultimately I finally ended up with like 176 hours of undergrad coursework.
That's amazing.
and ended up with, even though I have a BS, I actually have enough coursework to qualify for a BA in art and a BS in science. And so Shadron got kind of grouchy at the end because I had transferred down to UNL to get all these extra courses. Their administration was a little grouchy about that. So there was this, I don't know, I hesitate to use this word, maybe I shouldn't on tape. The competition between the colleges. Yeah, so I transferred down to UNL and I'm thinking, well, maybe I'll just use the credit from Shadron to get the degree from UNL. Well, UNL wouldn't take 76 of the credit hours. They refused to use them. So that aggravated me because I knew that the coursework was really good. I'd been there. I had a very good education from Shadron in spite of the actual limitations of the number of courses. But then I wanted to go back to Shadron. Well, Shadron didn't want to recognize what UNL was doing. So they took the coursework that I did from them and said, yeah, we'll give you a BS for the stuff you did for us. And you can just have this whole university thing over here. It's just extra, And so I was a little aggravated with the sort of administrative clashing going on that I got caught in the middle of because I really did earn 2 degrees, even though the 2 of them were just not going to give me 2 degrees. So I'm like, fine, okay, I'm not going to play bureaucratic games with the upper echelons of the university. I'm just going to go get busy and start illustrating. So I had made connections in the Department of Agronomy at UNL, plus Ron Whedon knew a bunch of people down there that he'd worked with, and he gave me recommendations. So they hired me as staff illustrator in 1986. And I worked full-time after that.
Okay, so you did that there for 4 years?
4 years, from 1986 to 1990. It was good because ultimately in the middle of that, I got married in 1985, and then I got pregnant in 1986. So I could work at home. Mm-hmm. I mean, because I wanted a certain amount of money for each illustration, and they could only pay me by hour. So I came to an agreement with my supervisor that each illustration, if you pay me this much money per hour, then this is how many illustrations you'll get for the amount of hours that you're paying for. So I could then go home, and we ultimately agreed to 5 illustrations a week, which was 1 per day, which I wouldn't be able to do now because the level of incredible complexity that I put in now, I would probably be going, no, you can have 2 per week for a full-time, because of the amount of work I do.
Well, just based on what I've seen in display that or exhibit that we're doing here, I just can't imagine how you could produce.
Right, it would be slave
two a
labor.
week. Yeah, 2 a week would be
It would be
incredible.
incredible. Well, and I look at maximum 20 hours. So if they're paying me for 40 hours, that's 2 a week, because they're paying me as a staff illustrator. So that's fair. But at that time, I agreed to an 8-hour block for each illustration. So that was 5 per week. So I could work at home and take care of my child. And it ended up being, thank goodness I was young, because, take care of the baby all day and do that, and then stay up half the night and draw, because I couldn't take care of the baby and draw in the same, block of time. So I spent like 4 years there kind of sleep deprived, but I was young enough that I could do that. I could not, no way could I do that now. I'm almost 15. It would kill me.
So what kinds of things did they have you do?
Everything. It literally was just whoever in the department, so she's hired by the Department of Agronomy. There's umpteen jillion professors in the Department of Agronomy. Floors. The whole agronomy building was several floors. And the guy that hired me, he was kind of territorial. He wanted to monopolize my time. So I did the bulk of the work for his projects. But other professors would come in, and one guy wanted me to draw a little, it was the corner of barbed wire. Sometimes, and I don't know why the ranchers do this, sometimes you'll see a post. Maybe it's a property line end point where they'll do a post and then they'll put a diagonal barbed wire stake down. And I can't think there'd be anything more than just the edge of the property marker. He wanted me to draw a little baby calf curled up in this little nook for spring. And then he wanted me to draw summer, just 4 seasons of this same corner. It was interesting the things that people would have me draw. One guy wanted me to draw center pivot. It was just whatever they happened to think of. Most of it was botanicals, though. A lot of it was grasses and how they developed rhizomes underground and track how. One guy he would have me draw the grass, and then he said, "Okay, the rhizome's going to grow off to one side." And he said, "I want you to show each stage of it as it comes out and sends up and then goes ahead and flowers itself." And so I would do stages and stages for him. It was just whatever they needed that they wanted for their publications.
So how do you, it seems like this is a highly specialized area of art. So how do you get better? And was there someone that sort of mentored you?
Just Ron. Okay. Yeah. Getting the administration to create a little niche for me where he could work with me individually. And he did let me have his library, access to his library in the herbarium. When I took plant taxonomy from him in Chadron my 3rd year, he actually would take me, and there were 2 or 3 other students that were as interested in plant taxonomy as I was. So he would actually take us into the field and help us collect specimens. And I thought that was interesting because taxonomy in of itself, the students are required to do that themselves. So he knows we're very into it. So he's all plugged in all around the countryside around in Chadron, which is just beautiful. And there's a lot of little varied little ecosystems, I guess would be the word, right around in that area. So he would take us to his favorite places and show us, this plant is this plant is this is the soil it's growing in, and we would just be rapidly writing, and collect, and we would dig up the specimen, clean it, take it back to the lab, get it pressed. He gave us access to his personal passion, where the rest of the students who were just taking it as a requirement didn't get as much access. So yeah, that one-on-one that I got from Chadron was highly beneficial to me, because it gave me a much more, a deeper understanding of what I needed to do in the beginning to see the plants. If you didn't see it in the field, if you're just going into the herbarium and, opening the cabinet, pulling out those pressed specimens, it's beautiful in the sense that, you've got this archived, but to see it in the field and take it from a living plant all the way through pressed specimen, it aided me later in terms of looking at the pressed specimen and going, okay, I can visualize this in the field because I was trained to collect it from the field. And even if I'd never seen it, I could still extrapolate. So the longer I did it, the better I got. I could actually get a pressed specimen and look at it, read the description that Ron provides for me, and just visually pick it up off the page and just blow it into 3-dimension in my mind and turn it around in my mind. And it got better. The more years I did it, I could visualize almost everything. So there were rare occasions where I couldn't. When I was completely unfamiliar with the flower, it's really complicated, and I'm like, I need a photo of this, or you got to send me something that's, because this specimen is mangled to the point where I'm like having trouble figuring out what slot A went into slot B, It's just not working for me. We need more resources. So,
what kinds of things do you think you see when you look at a plant that other people
don't see?
Yeah.
Oh, everything. It's amazing. To me, I guess the best way to describe the way I view the world is my husband taking me up. We live near the mountains, obviously. And when we first moved there, he wants to go explore every little back road and let's go check out these views. And I'm with him. I'm great. He's standing there going, check out that mountain. I'm down here on the ground looking at the plants, going, cool, look at this, because to me, my entire focus for the world, especially when I'm in nature, is to look at what's growing. I don't even see the scenery first. I have to get up and go, okay, that's nice now. Let's get into this, You sort of stand there and go, cool, now. And it's funny because I'll actually look at the plant, and if it's growing in a particular kind of soil, I actually want to pull it up and look sometimes. If there's a lot of them, sometimes I will. But if it looks like it's like one, I don't want to disturb it because I was trained from the very beginning that some plants are rare. And if you go into an area, you don't know whether this plant is rare. So if you go in there and there's like 5,000 of these things growing, well, pull one up, have a look, But if it's the only one growing that you can see, don't do that. Because you might be destroying something that's on the edges of, oblivion. So I actually pay attention to what's growing where. And if there's a lot, I will pull it up if I want to see what the root looks like. Or if it's something I've drawn that I've never actually seen in the wild, better. Because then I know what it looks like. And I want to compare what I've visualized with reality. Mm-hmm. And 99.9% of the time, my visualizations are as accurate as reality. So it's almost like a validation when you see something growing that you've never really been exposed to and go, okay, I got that right. Cool.
So how did you establish your connection with Ron Turrell?
That was a funny story. We actually had to think back on that because it was like, how did we meet? Really, in 1988, Ron Whedon came down from Chadron, and I was already living in Lincoln, working for the Department of Agronomy as an illustrator. And he was taking a bunch of students down to Missouri Botanical Garden to a symposium. And he came through Lincoln, stopped, and picked me up. And then we all went down there. There were like 3 cars. I met a lot of nice people that weekend, and he was encouraging me to meet professors. He said, you really need to, because I had expressed some dislike for working in an environment where I had so little creative control. Because at UNL, it was great. You're a production artist. You do just sheer volume and you get better just by sheer repetition. But you don't have any creative control. So he was like, well, you should just go out and freelance. And I had already been kind of leaning towards freelancing anyway. But I had a young baby and I was still putting my husband through college, so I needed a steady paycheck. But he's like, no, you still need to go out and make some connections for when your husband graduates, and you go ahead and pursue working on your own. And so I went down there with him and got a list of a lot of the professors that were there, because there were lists of people, I forget who, somebody at the college or at the Missouri Botanical Garden said, we have lists of people from Texas and Oklahoma and, just various surrounding states that had come in for the symposium. And I just started writing down all the names and sending out portfolios to everybody on the list. Ron was one of those people. And he contacted me immediately. He was like, I need an illustrator. I want to do, this field guide to Oklahoma plants. And we've been hooked up ever since. And even though I didn't actually meet him in person until 2 days ago, I feel like, after a 20-year relationship on the phone, mm-hmm. he is a good friend. He's hung with me through thick and thin and thick and thick. It's just been a wonderful working relationship. For what I do, I never really needed to be in the same room. He could send me specimens and descriptions of what he wanted, and I had all the equipment, and I could produce it and send stuff back to him, and it works, provided the mail doesn't lose things, and occasionally, once in a while, that happened. Fortunately, none of the originals were ever lost, but occasionally stuff would get lost once in a while, but for the most part, it was really beneficial to both of us. So, yeah, it's kind of strange, though. 2 days ago, I get to put a face together with a voice. And he essentially looked the same as I pictured him, except I pictured him for some reason with brown hair.
Oh, okay.
And he's silver, but he's 65, you know, so of course
So
he's going to have
earned it,
silver
right?
hair. Yeah. You know, when you have someone in your mind and you hold an image after you haven't met them, it is an odd thing, particularly for an artist who visualizes everything, and you just don't picture them aging. It's not part of the process because the voice is always the same. So you get this sort of static imagery in your mind that, you know, how your children grow, and you're forced to, you know, reassess that image. With a phone conversation, you're not forced to see the changes, so you don't mentally change that. It was a strange thing, I think, for him too, although he's not the artist, so he maybe didn't focus so much on, you know, what I looked like.
Right.
But
one of the questions that obviously I wanted to ask you, but I'm sort of hesitating to ask you it because I know you're going to talk about it in your presentation.
Oh, that's all right.
I
mean, I don't mind being repetitive. Go for it.
Well, I'm just interested to sort of how the process works from, you know, you get something in the mail and then what happens?
Oh, basically, assuming that it comes in good shape. No, get it out, get the description. First thing I do is set the description aside and I just interact with the plant material, because in most cases, it's something I've not seen, you know, or if I have seen it, I haven't seen it like this. And so I will just, and the labels, you know, who collected it, when they collected it, where they collected it, the dates. I'm always intrigued. Ron occasionally sends me specimens. I've even seen some that were collected in the late 1800s.
Wow.
Which are just like, you look at it and you're like, wow, the first thing that occurs to me is, here's this person that did this, and it's a legacy of and they're dead, but wow, it's still here. And you know, you think about the age of the specimen and how well it was preserved, and just getting into the science behind the specimen itself, and then looking at the beauty of the plant itself, depending on the pressing. Some of the plants I look at and I'm like, okay, I just can't find that attractive no matter what. You know, rarely though, because I am very passionate about plants. And then I will read what he has written as taxonomically correct or relevant to the identification of this plant as such. And it's funny because a lot of the cases, Ron's so thorough that he'll have gone through and done what is called an annotation label to bring the labels up to date. Because as I told you, my frustration with taxonomists is they love to change the names of things. Every little whip stitch, you just think you've got this under your belt, and you changed it to what? You know? And I would think it would make a lot more work for them, because they're going to have to go through and annotate every specimen in those herbariums. And if it's a big herbarium, oh, that's a big job. You know, but he'll put his little annotation labels, and I don't know, just the whole process of getting familiar with the plant. Then I read the description and I look at what's there. And sometimes what he wants and what's there, I can't, you know, I'll have to call him up and say, okay, this is not showing this. Can you send me some additional plant material? Or if this is here, it doesn't seem to match what you want, you know, me to draw in the way you seem to have indicated. But a lot of times, and when I first started working with him, I was like, okay, you can't send me specimens that are glued down to within an inch of their life, because if I can't dissect it, I can't draw it, because I can't do the tiny structures on the mount. They won't fit under my scope. I'll end up having to shove the paper under there and it'll bend and it can crack the specimens and damage them. And I'm not willing to do that. So I'm like, send me these scrappy old specimens that aren't glued down that you don't care about, you know, because I am going to cut things off of them. So I generally wouldn't get the, you know, the pristine things that, you know, oh, this is the best example of this we've ever seen. Stick it aside, you know.
Yeah. Send me the second best example.
Well, I'm actually going, okay, send me the stuff that's representative that you don't care about, ultimately. Sometimes they don't have much choice, but Ron's very passionate about what he does, so he usually has quite a few examples. Sometimes he sends me, I require a minimum of 4, because if I've just got one specimen, what if it's a little tiny bit different? What if there's been some tiny adaptation that some plant has gotten because of where it grew, whether it was more dry or whether it had more sun or whether it had better soil or what kind of competition it had, anything that can affect the growth habit. I need to see at least enough samples that I know that this is statistically relevant as a structure, you know. So he would send at least 4, but sometimes he'd send 12 or 15, you know, depending on what he had that, you know. If a flower was too well glued down on this one, but the seed pods are great, then we're going to send a flower, you know. On his end, he does just as much work preparing for me to draw it as I do drawing it. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded explanation, but, you know, then I will take and look at this thing. And I was talking to Mary last night in the department, the taxonomist, and she was like, well, what do you do with these really complicated things like sage or something that you look at and it's just this wad of incredibly, like 50 stems and 1,000 leaves, and they're all really tiny and they're branching pretty much ad infinitum. And that's where that ability that I have to sort of pick the whole plant up in my mind and visualize it in 3D comes into play, because I will look at something, read the description, look at it again, read the description again, and then I will figure out what is important structurally that makes this plant what it is. And then I will mentally take that doesn't need to be there, that doesn't need to be there, that doesn't need to be there, and preserve the integrity of the plant by simplifying it and yet retaining its complexity so it's accurate. And that is something that no computer will ever be able to do, because I'm actually just interpreting what I see to simplify it to the point where it's a useful illustration. So after that's done, then I do some preliminary sketching on the board, kind of like Matisse. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but you draw a line here, draw a line there, you draw a line over here, and there's a little hint of, okay, so you got fibrous roots, so I'll take my pencil and go, nothing detailed, just a basic layout. And then when I begin, then I draw it as I want it finished, in every bit as much detail as the ink, because later I'm going to go back and ink over those lines. So they have to be accurate. So the pencil sketch is as accurate as the ink. It just doesn't have any shading. Or like if I come to a plant that's covered with a bunch of hairs, I will draw one little section of the stem that has hairs. But I'm not going to take the time to put every single hair in pencil, because that's a waste of my time. Mm-hmm. I need to do it in ink, but I'm not going to do it in pencil. I'll just indicate it, and then I'll write a little note to myself. Hairs like this on all other surfaces. So when I come back to it, okay, and then you just sit there for hours and put 5 million hairs on, because that is the tedious part. But it's also my favorite part. Once I get that inked and I draw that outline in, then I carefully erase those pencil lines. I leave the notations in. I'll just erase the drawing out from under. And then I go back using my own notes that I've written very lightly in pencil, and then ink everything and shade everything. And then when I'm finally done, then I erase my pencil notations and it's finished. I recently, like in the last, I think I started Photoshop in 2004. Then I'll go scan it into the computer and then enlarge and move around. And I love Photoshop. It's taken something where I had to be really careful about where I was laying things out and sizing things initially. But with Photoshop, I can just draw anything any old where I want, because I can take it and I can rotate it in space. I can turn it around. I can, it's the most amazing thing. You can take a drawing that would have normally been static, and the way you drew it is the way it is, and create incredible fluidity. So for me, Photoshop is like artistic nirvana. You get in there and you go, everything's drawn, now let's make it cool, for the final product. And that's what Ron and I've gotten to do. Originally, we were sending pencil sketches back and forth in the mail, and we still do to some extent, but mostly now we just email, attach, files, and he'll take a look and make notes on the, and then he'll scan it, and then he'll send me that back scanned. And, so not even a paper trail exists for the last few drawings that we did, which is in a way kind of sad, because there won't be anything for you to archive on the last batch. But, so that basically is it. That's the whole process. And of course, with the PowerPoint, I've shown examples. I mean, I have pieces of his descriptions, and I have examples of my pencil sketches, and I get into a lot more detail about how Ron works his corrections on my work, because if I'm working with a pressed specimen, it's not going to look the way it looks in the field. And sometimes if I'm completely unfamiliar with it, its growth habit could be different. For instance, if you've got a tree where the branches hang down like this, they're not going to press it that way. They're just going to lay everything down to try and expose the structure. So I'm looking at this thinking, okay, it grows like this, not like this. Oh, okay. So when I draw something as it looks on the specimen, not being familiar with it, that's where errors creep in. So he goes, no, it doesn't actually grow like it does on the specimen. You got to bend it, or you got to, and then I make corrections. So.
Are there any particular memories that really stand out for you in terms of your working relationship with Ron and with the rest of the team for the field guide?
Wow. Specific plants, things that just give me they're so beautiful that I was just like, or they were so aggravating that when you finish it, you're like, oh, finally. There's one in the presentation that I talk about, and I put it in there simply because of the incredibly aggravating nature of it. It's called antelope horn milkweed, and you'll see it when you... Milkweed as a group has these little structures called pollinia, which are very odd-looking little things. You'll see a photo of it. It looks like an upside-down set of horns.
And what's the purpose of
it? Produces pollen for the flower. But they're minuscule. They're teeny, tiny little things, and you have to sort of coax them out. Milkweed flowers are small. Mm-hmm. You're looking at an umbel of things that mostly they grow in a ball, where the flower stalks all come from a single point called an umbel. And so when they press them, you get kind of this mushed. The flowers get crushed into the flowers because you can't, there's no, it just kind of spread out. You can put one over here and over here and over here. No, it should crunch down into this squished little ball. And I'm like in there with the tweezers lifting, trying to pull one up, drop it in the wetting solution, and try to coax out a pollinia, tears, cracks, breaks. I must have done that 40 times with that bloody plant. And I was just like, Ron, I'm going to have your whole specimen destroyed because I can't get a pollinia out of these flowers. It's driving me nuts. Do you have anything a little fresher? And I finally managed to get one. I was like, oh, it didn't break. Because something that small, you can't infer. You can't visualize because you haven't seen it. Mm-hmm. So you have to have it intact in order to infer. And so when I finally got it coaxed out of the flower and it was intact, I'm like... It's like floating around in the water. I'm like, okay, I've got to get it out of here before it floats off because it's so small that, So I did. When I finally got it drawn and it was accurate and Ron okayed it, I was like, thank God. It's done. Those are the kinds of events that stand out for me, where something is either so aggravatingly difficult or so incredibly beautiful. I love the genus Oenothera, which is the evening primrose genus. And he hadn't included many of those in the first edition. So when he pulled the next, I think he had 74, 75 new plants for the second edition that I did. There were so many beautiful flowers in that set. I was just, oh my gosh, all these beautiful Oenotheras, just lobelias, penstemons, a lot of the large showy flowers that those things, when I draw them, they're just amazing. Like I have everybody, I don't know if you've heard of trumpet vine. A lot of people use them in their gardens. But they're also wild. So I have trumpet vine in my yard, and he sends me specimens, and I'm like, oh, trumpet vine. So you put it together that, okay, it is a wild, and it is an ornamental too. People use it. So I'm out in the garden pulling live specimens because it's always better when you can use something fresh, and ended up with that trumpet vine being one of my favorite illustrations, simply because I got to work with the pressed and the living, and the plant is so beautiful. When someone says draw, oh, golly, there was a couple of sages that were just so incredibly repetitive, drawing the same tiny little leaf 5,000 times. Those kinds of things get to be no fun. They're tedious. They still have to be accurate. You still have to include all of that kind of stuff. Or if I can't quite get it right. There was one grass that I did for Ron, and I never was happy with it, even though we finally just said, okay, fine, let's just quit here. And we've drawn it 3 times now. It's just not working. Where something is so fuzzy that if you were to draw every single line, it would just be black. So you have to learn to not put stuff in and still imply the fuzz. And I was never happy with that one. I don't think he was either, but he didn't want to hurt my feelings. And I'm like, okay, hurt him. I'm great. I'm so flexible. I can take criticism from anybody, particularly with my art. If you like it, great. If you don't, okay, no biggie. And if it's not right, let's work on it until it is. I don't have ego attached to this process at all. If he hires me to do this job, I want to do the best I can, period. And that was a great thing about working with Ron. He was never all that worried about my ego because it was never an issue. So it was like we could work and he could say, I need you to change this. This still isn't right, And I'd be like, no problem. So there was this incredible fluidity of comfort as working with a scientist where we both know each other well enough that there's no issues involved around the kinds of changes he needed to make. And he liked the fact that I was such a perfectionist. He really did, because it made his job easier. He didn't have to criticize, or I guess criticize is not the right word. He didn't have to make extensive corrections. Mm-hmm. A lot of times he would put ready to ink. I'd send him a pencil sketch and he'd just take his little red pen, write ready to ink. You could tell he was a grader because he always had the red pen, cracked me up. I'm like, cool, And I would say probably 75 to 80% of them would come back with ready to ink written on them. I wouldn't even have to make changes. If there were changes, they were subtle. One time in one flower, I think it was anyway, it looked to me like a violet, even though I know it wasn't a violet, but it was similar to that kind of structure. And I had drawn it flat. And he basically wanted me to turn it into 3/4 view so you could get more of a 3-dimensional, feeling from the flower. Because sometimes you want the diagrammatic look because that's what the student looks for accuracy. But he actually wanted a more artsy, so I just erased it and redrew it in the 3-dimensional or in the 3/4. He's like, cool. Sometimes it was preference. Sometimes it was just straight practicality. So.
What about color? I mean, when you get dried specimens, how do you end up accurately replicating that?
Color?
Yeah, and I know for what you were doing for him that these are black and white.
Right.
But for what you do.
The color, well, that's such a fluid thing because really, even within plants growing, the color can vary. It's like ultimately I end up with the people, because color work for me is commission work because they don't publish it. It's too expensive to reprint. So if someone comes to me and says, I want a violet purple iris, I'm like, okay, how violet? And you give me a little paint swatch and I'll just paint it the way you want it. And that's largely the determining factor with my color. If I'm doing it for myself, I will look at a color range in a flower and I'll pick my favorite. And there's one piece in here that Ron didn't want to include in the exhibit because it was the commission piece. And it's the opuntia. And the macrorrhiza I was telling you it was polycanth. And then they changed it this year again. So a person came to me who wanted this macrorrhiza painted in neon fluorescent pink. And it doesn't occur that way in nature. But they wanted it. And to me, it's like, you're going to take a piece of my black and white. You want me to color it for something that you want to hang on your wall. Okay. I mean, there's a part of me that will be fluid about the artistic end. Dealing with Ron, he's looking at this piece going, it doesn't grow like that. And I'm like, I know. I figured you'd nix that from the exhibit because it's not technically accurate. But it is a beautiful piece of paint, of a painting, So I'm actually able to bridge back and forth to people who commission pieces to do it whatever they want. If they want it accurate, then I'll try to find a photograph that I think is as accurate as possible. Because photographs, depending on where they're taken, can be completely inaccurate too. So it's just easier to go to the person commissioning. Well, what color do you want it? Then you'll be happy. I'll be happy. I'll get my money. The artwork will be beautiful. Everybody wins, know.
That sounds like a good plan. You recently have had to call an end to your work as a botanical illustrator.
Breaks my heart.
I mean, as much as you want to talk about that, could you just tell us about that and what your plans are?
Really, it took my doctors basically waving their finger under my nose last August because I knew it was getting to be a serious problem. I knew that working was beginning to create so much pain. And I was doing everything I could think of. I was having surgeries. I did physical therapy. I did everything I could to stop this degeneration in my spine. And it wasn't working. And finally, I finished up the project for Ron in July of 2007. And I was scheduled for my entire annual workup with my spine in August in Omaha, because all my doctors in Omaha haven't found anybody that I think is worth their salt in Denver, which kind of surprises me because you got a bigger pool of doctors in Denver than Omaha, but whatever. So I'm going back to Omaha to have my workup, and my two doctors, especially my my physiatrist, he's a pain doctor, took a look at the x-ray of my spine and basically said, "Are you nuts? I cannot help you anymore if you keep doing this, because you are causing the degeneration to accelerate so fast that you're going to be crippled by the time you're 60. Absolutely crippled. You will not be able to hold your head up. You will not be able to, you will lose sensation in your hands because the nerves are going to be so damaged that, he just basically was like, and I'm like, okay, I already have been a chronic pain sufferer because of 2 back surgeries for the last, golly, when did I have my first one? 1997. Over 10 years, I've been dealing with chronic pain. I don't want it to get any worse. It's already at the threshold of, gosh, this is kind of wrecking my life. And if it's worse, and it can be, because coming out of post-op after a couple of back surgeries, you really understand how bad pain can be when you have something that catastrophic. I'm looking at that going, I'm kind of at the limit of what I can tolerate now. I don't want it to get worse.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very hard because I just adore Ron. And the relationship that we have is so good. Our working relationship is so fluid. I don't want to disappoint him, you know? So I literally had to, and I've been trying to stop for 5 years. I mean, I've been kind of telling him, I need to quit. And then he's like, but just do one more thing, you know? Because, you know, we just work well together. And he's passionate and so am I. And he's so nice, I never wanted to say no. And it was so hard. And I ultimately ended up having to write it down in a letter because I was so sad. I thought, I can't have this conversation with him on the phone or I'm going to cry. You know, it's sort of horrible. So I wrote him this big long letter and I didn't hear from him for 3 weeks. And I was like, uh-oh, I hurt his feelings. You know, but he was like, calls me up in 3 weeks and he's like, well, I understand. And he was so cool about it. And then he said, well, we want to do some honorariums for you. And that's when he set up this weekend. And I was like, that says it all right there. The respect that he gave back to me. You know, he knew because he's had to nurse me through 2 back surgeries. I mean, talk about patience of Job here, you know. I can't work for 2 years, Ron. I got to do rehab, you know. Sorry about your project, but, you know, there it is, you know.
So did he wait or did he follow?
He waited.
Oh, okay.
He absolutely waited. He knew that we had such a good working relationship and he likes my style. And I've been told by people that look at it when they finally understand what I do, the visualizing, the simplifying, the interpreting to get to the illustration, or they go into the literature and look at some of the existing illustrations, which in most cases are, not to sound arrogant, but they're just inferior.
Mm-hmm.
They're hard to see. They're jumbled. They're in some cases inaccurate. They've been blacked out because they've been drawn too small to begin with, so they don't have enough detail. I had an artist look at my presentation on Monday. She's a college professor and I wanted to run it by her. I'm like, give me your, you know, I want to run the speech by you. I want you to see the PowerPoint. Give me your feedback. You've got both graphic and teaching skill. I lack the teaching skill. I want your critique. And she looked at my work and she said, oh my God, she said, you're so much more than an illustrator is. You're not copying. You're not taking an image and creating an illustration. You're actually using this incredible ability that you have. Because she looked at the press specimen. She's like, how did you get from that pile of junk, that wadded up mess of mangled plant material to this beautiful thing? She's like, what's cool about what you do is we can look at this image and it's simple and you can see everything at a glance. And I never had looked at it that way. I thought, having not had all that much contact with other illustrators, particularly in my field, because there just aren't that many of us, mm-hmm. I didn't realize that another illustrator who I hold in great esteem for her skill would look at my work and go, I couldn't do it. I just could not visualize that mangled mess and create that beautiful interpretation. I couldn't do it. And I thought, wow, okay, maybe I'm a little unique. It was kind of a little shot of blood to the ego, you know. I mean, honestly, it's an odd thing to watch other artists and they interact with their audience. I don't, not ever. You know, I'm sitting up there producing drawing after drawing after drawing, and the only person I have in contact with is Ron for 20 years. You know, plus the commission pieces. So I find when I come down here and I meet all these people that like my work, I'm like, really? Wow. I mean, who knew? You know, I mean, somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that people were using my work and it was a benefit to them to learn the science, which is ultimately your ultimate goal. When I'm creating that, looking at it, how can I simplify this so the student and everybody, not only is it beautiful, but it's accurate and it's easy to interpret and the structures are large enough that they can, you know, those things I do in my work, but the piece that was missing was the actual interaction with the audience. So that's been kind of interesting for me, you know, because lay people, they look at my work and they go, oh, it's a nice botanical. But when they really understand what I do, they kind of go, oh my gosh, that's not the usual botanical thing that's in, like, say, the big book of petunias, you know, yeah. Or the coffee table book of roses, you know. I mean, they're beautiful and their craftsmanship is outstanding, but they don't do what I do. So, I don't know. You know, you sit by yourself for years, and it is a solitary thing. I spend a lot of time just thinking about visualizing what I'm doing. Put on a little music. You know, sometimes I have the TV on in the background, depending on how boring the specimen is. Because sometimes if there's 5,000 little leaves, you know, turn on some TV program that you can listen to, you know, that'll engage your brain. But if it's something I'm really passionate about, I don't need that. I don't need the distraction from the tedium. So I'm sorry I'm kind of all over the map. No one's asked me to describe this in such an intricate fashion before. So it's prompting sort of a cascade of connections in the way I'm telling you this, because like, oh yeah, and this and this.
But I think it'll be so helpful to people that come and use the material later on.
I hope so. I hope so.
This way.
You know, and ultimately that comes down to it. Instead of being really sad that I'm not going to be able to do this anymore, the consolation of this is I look back on over 2,000 illustrations, artwork that I've legitimately authorized in over 75 publications. I Googled my name once on the internet and I'm looking, okay, I authorized this, not this, not this, not this, not this, not this. I mean, it was kind of like, oh, bummer. But then on the other hand, I may not have gotten paid for it, but wasn't the ultimate goal to get it out there for the students to use? And if the professors are taking it out of publications that I've done and reusing it, they like it. It's accurate. It's become public domain. And maybe I didn't make any money off it, but I'm never really all that much into the money in the first place. It was more about creating the art for the art's sake, so that the students and people could get in and have an easier time of things. So I stepped back from that initial, gosh, I didn't authorize that, to, wow, a lot of people are using my work,
right.
Well,
that's still an incredibly generous philosophy, though.
Well, and I know other artists that get really bitter because they look at their work and it's theirs. It's like you really, and I really understand the idea that when you create something, you really do put a piece of yourself into it because you invest your time and your creative effort. And even though you may not visualize your brain power as something that's tangible on the paper, it really kind of is when you create art. And they when someone takes their imagery and uses it without authorization, they get bitter because they didn't get compensated for this time. And I decided very early on, I'm too happy a person for that. It's ultimately the students will benefit. And in a curious sort of way, I've seen myself in a very tiny little narrow niche, become famous in my lifetime while I'm still alive.
Right, which most artists
never see. And so in a way, I proved my father wrong. You're not, if your work becomes known at all, you're never going to benefit from it. You're never going to know because they're not going to want to purchase a body of your work until it's a finite supply, i.e. no more is being made. And that's not the case here.
So is he still alive?
Oh yeah, he's 30 years older than I am. I'm 47. He's 77. Okay. So I turn 48 next month, and we just kind of track. It was funny that one time he turned 30, or he turned 60. I turned 30. In the same year. It was like, oh wow, cool. No, he still has a lot of impact on my life, and it's so cool to come down here and see this school and realize that he went to college here. And I'm like, how did I sort of miss that? All these years I've been working with Ron and OSU, and I knew it, but then getting down here and seeing how beautiful this school is and walking around in the grounds and sort of getting back into the college milieu, not locked up in the studio by yourself, going, wow, I can see why Ron wants to be here all the time. It's a stimulating and a beautiful place. And so both my aunt, my father's sister, and my dad went here.
Oh, okay. So do you know when he graduated?
I don't. I really don't. And that's been the kind of questioning that's going through my mind, making this little list of call Dad up when you get back, ask him this and this and this and this, was this building still here? And did you do that? And, suddenly it's prompted a whole series of inquiry that I'm going to have with him. I'm trying to
find him in the yearbook before you leave.
If he's there. I mean, I think that he ended up being tapped to go to Korea. Okay. Honestly, I really don't think he finished here.
Okay.
I don't know for sure. That's why I've got this list of questions, because I do know that he served in Korea in a MASH unit. And I do know that it interrupted his college career. I'm just not sure what part. Mm-hmm. So I've got to find out, if for nothing else than for my children and keeping the family archive accurate.
Sure.
So.
Well, that's an interesting connection.
I think so too, Well, and then like I told you, coming down here and finding out how friendly everybody is, and I'm thinking, I want to live here. Everybody's so nice.
It's a wonderful place. What advice would you offer to someone that's looking at botanical illustration as a career path?
A lot of people say that, and I think there's kind of a mythology out there that artistic ability is innate, it's inborn. I do think that happens, but I don't think that if you aren't born with it, you can't acquire it. So start from the premise that, okay, this, like any technical skill, with practice can be acquired. I've felt that way from the very beginning because, okay, I had this basic love of art, this sort of almost like knowing in your heart what you're supposed to do when you just at a very young age. That's very unusual. Okay, maybe someone isn't born with that, but they have a lot of technical skill and interest. And interest really is the key. If you've got a passion about something, you can become excellent at it. You just have to train yourself. So Mary, when speaking to her last night, working with Ron, she's working on her master's in taxonomy. And I think she's teaching, was what I gleaned from the conversation last night. I wish I could remember her last name. She's expressed some interest in having me train her. She's like, but I'm not an artist. And I'm like, oh, that doesn't matter. You're obviously passionate about taxonomy. You understand the terminology. You love the plants as much as I do. It was almost like we went to this meeting of the minds moment. Running out of tape?
No, we're good. We're good for a few more minutes.
Okay.
And I've got more tape.
Sorry, I'm so verbose. But no, I told her, come to Longmont for a week or two. Stay with me and I will train you. Because I can train her. Because she has the innate passion for the plants and the understanding of the science already under her belt, which is the hardest part. Most people come at it from the other direction, like me, where you're coming in from the artistic standpoint and you look at the science. And if you aren't, because there really are people that are right brain or left brain. I just happen to be probably I'm a little more right brain than most, but I do have a good left brain component that can really get into the science and the detail. If you're coming at it from that way, you can train yourself to be an artist more easily, I think, than coming at it from an artistic standpoint and trying to train yourself to be a meticulous scientist. Having done both and worked with people that are interested in coming at it from both directions, teaching her the art will be easier than teaching her the science. Because right brain people have a hard time with the meticulous organization of plant tax. Because I tell people, you think about what a doctor has to know for terminology, for anatomy, say. You have to learn every organ, every tissue, every muscle, every insertion, every origin. Everything is named. Even parts of specific things have names within names. Taxonomy is even more complex. And every plant has different structures. At least with the human body, you have a finite number of things to learn. You get to a new plant, you've got to get a whole new range of descriptive terminology to describe what's different about this than this one. So it almost becomes a proposition of infinity, even though it's not. For people who aren't trained there, they go, oh, I can't do it. And if you can't, you can't. But so I'm going to train her. I'm going to start her off with some basic, okay, we're going to start with some, what do you like? She likes roses. Okay, draw a rose. Let's see how you visualize. So my first step would be to see how she's visualizing so I can train her to visualize accurately. Because if she's not visualizing in 3-dimension, which you have to do, then I have to train her to make that leap, which isn't that hard. You can start by copying photographs. You get your own photographs, go out in the field, take some pictures. That's what I've done. My husband has taken countless photographs for me. And then I'll go look at the photograph, and that automatically trains my brain in 3-dimension. And the more of those 3-dimensional photographs you look at, that's just another step in the training process. And then of course, draftsmanship, that's an acquired skill. Mm-hmm. So once you've made the leap from interpretive and 3-dimensional visualization, then it's just a drafting skill. And then you train yourself, okay, this is what, say you want to draw a hairy stem. There's 2 levels of things you have to draw there. You have to contour that stem so it looks round. So I have to train her how to do the lines. Do you need to stop?
Sorry.
Okay. To resume. Okay, if you would, picture just the stem of a plant. What I need to train her to do, let's pick 3 basic features that you're going to try to draw in the drawing so that it will look like it looks on the specimen. First of all, a stem is basically one big long cylinder. So you have to learn to shade for that. Now, what if that stem has hairs all over it? Now, you can't draw so many hairs that you've obscured the shading of the cylinder. Or if it has hairs and grooves. Some stems you can see the venation, the vertical, think of a grass where you can see all the parallel venation in the leaves and in the stalks. So you've got hairs, you've got venation, you've got curvature. So you have to learn to balance each of those draftsman skills and not overdo, because if you put too much in, when you reproduce it, it's going to turn black. And the detail, particularly if it gets reduced radically. Mm-hmm. I try to start small. I start 8 by 10 anyway, because I don't want to go much further from 8 by 10. Usually we go from 8 by 10 down to 5 by 7. You go much further, and even my stuff gets fused and blacks out. I just call it reduction obscurity. It's like, oh my gosh, I know some scientists who were not artists who draw things unbelievably huge. They'll go in and draw a bud that's like this big on the page, and they'll do dots that are so large, and they'll almost use a magic marker. And then when they reduce it, it looks like my illustration but they have to start big because they know that if they start small and reduce it smaller, it's going to be lost. I'm not into gigantic reductions. I try to stay as close as possible. But I will be training her in basic draftsmanship. These are all the kinds of things you're going to encounter. These are all the surfaces you're going to encounter. These are the basic things you need to do to shade a leaf, to shade a flower petal, to shade a stem, to shade a root, to create these structures. Start with some basis, and then, okay, you got more complicated. This is what you do to preserve the underlying drawing and then add detail to that. It's just a matter of teaching, as I spoke of earlier, the process, for pity's sake. And no one ever taught me the process. If you look at my work, if you track it, and I did after Ron prompted me to produce this piece about what made me an artist, and I'm going back through my portfolio, even from my young childhood, I have everything. My mother was passionate about saving every last scrap I ever stuck a crayon on. And I was always a botanical illustrator, even when I didn't know it. I've got flowers and plants and twigs and just in every medium I was ever working with or taught with or exposed to. I'm drawing plants. It must have just been, what I was supposed to do. But I can still train the technique, and they can develop their own style. But you don't have all that much room for stylistic interpretation with botanicals because they have to be accurate, period. And if it's this scale and it's this level of shading and this level of complication, you can only do so much, which is why I included some of my pieces in the exhibit to show what my individual style is, particularly those watercolor irises. That's what I'm going to do. That's where I'm going to end up. Now that I'm done with the illustration, which is just sitting like this, hunching forward, just basically, your body has to be held so still in order for the lines to be so accurate that my spine just goes, ow. But with watercolor, I can lay a piece of paint out, or paper out, and get the paint on the brush and swoosh and swing, and I'm not sitting here just hunched over and for hours and hours and hours creating 5,000 dots or 5 million hairs or, or just the line. People are like, how can you draw a straight line? I'm like, I can't draw a straight line. What I can draw is an uninterrupted line, because botanicals can't be like, a series of lines like you're just doing a rough sketch. You have to have extremely fine control, which is why I ended up having 2 surgeries for carpal tunnel, because I'm holding my hand for hours, very still and just precisely moving. I would hazard a guess, if with 2,000 illustrations, millions of hairs and millions of dots that I've created with my hand. And after that, you do come up against the wall of, sort of physical limitation. So, but paint, oh my gosh, it's fluid. It's like whoosh, 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 take a break, breathe, cool, look what that did, and then whoosh, whoosh, I can still create beautiful work without the incredibly taxing nature of the precision involved. So that's what I'm going to do. I have this painting at home. I wish I had finished it for this exhibit. It's about half the size of this table.
And
it's a watercolor iris again. Only this time, you know how the irises are roughly accurate in size on the painting that's next to the podium.
Right.
The iris in this picture, this big. I love Georgia O'Keeffe.
Yeah, I was just thinking that Georgia O'Keeffe.
It's not her style in the sense that I'm copying. First, she works in oils, and she did things that were interpretive. I actually am going to try to keep it accurate. I'm just going to get big, and then my level of interpretation is coming in. She blended all her colors, and the style that I've developed with watercolor is to draw everything out in pencil and make each shape a discrete little bubble. In other words, if you go look at that iris picture, every petal, every leaf, everything is separate, and then I blend it out in the end. So I'm still even kind of anal about the paint. But I allow the paint within each of those little bubbles to do what it's going to do. Uh-huh. I'll get it wet. I'll just wet that one little spot, and then I'll get the colors I want on the palette, and then I'll just start dropping it in and just let it bleed and flow. And sometimes I have to just step back and go, let it go. Don't try to control it, because after years of controlling every last dot, the exercise of painting is actually very freeing for me. It's a stimulating thing. I'm looking forward to it enormously. And I have 18-foot ceilings in my living room. My husband bought me a beautiful home.
So you have some great...
I have this fantastic, huge, empty space up there, and you can't put little stuff up there because it's way the heck up there.
Right.
You know, you got to have big, which is why I thought, okay, I'm going to start with an iris this big, you know, because it needs to be able to be seen from way up there.
Right.
So that was, you know, prompted by a space necessity, but then getting into it, going, hey, this is fun. I can see why George O'Keeffe wanted to make it big.
So you have 2 children. What about them? Do they have any artistic?
They do, but it manifests in different ways. My son, when he was little, he used to draw tiny, tiny little things. I mean, he would draw itty bitty little cars, little people. I mean, it was very good, and it was all very small. And I thought, oh gosh, he's got my same ability, just this ability to focus into the tiniest little minutiae and create. But he kind of gradually moved away from art, and now he's a writer. And he'll be 22 years old next month, and he's already written 3 novels. So he paints with words, and what he's let me read is astonishingly good. I believe that if he will pursue it, if the details of life do not get in the way, you know, the having to get a breath, having to earn a paycheck, and having to do the big details, not the little ones, that he could potentially be a very great author. And then, of course, my daughter, her talent, she's more like me in the fact that she's both right and left-brained, and she's absolutely gifted with music. I bought her a flute in 6th grade. The first week she had it, she taught herself to play Beethoven's Ode to Joy with no instruction. I heard her playing that in her room 5 days after I bought that flute for her. And I went up there, what are you doing? I'm playing my flute. And she played it for me. And I'm just like, pick my jaw up off the floor. Who teaches themselves fingering and notes by themselves in 6th grade? You know, she's astonishing. She really is. And for someone so young, she's tough. I've never met anyone who is so able to, their ego is so intact at such a young age, so able to be who they are and not care what anyone else thinks or does. She could potentially be a politician. I've watched her work a room. I like to have parties, dinner parties, and people over, and I don't exclude my children from any event. And she'll work the room like a politician. She'll go, hi, how are you? What you been doing? And I'm like, oh my gosh, you know. You know? She's a very talented, she wants to be a surgeon, a transplant surgeon. Hearts, kidneys, livers. So she hasn't quite picked out what she wants to do yet.
So how old is she?
Right now she's 14.
Okay.
And she's a powerhouse. She's got extremely high IQ. I actually had one teacher in 3rd grade. Wouldn't put her in the gifted club because she was, get this, too gifted. She saw her IQ from the test and she goes, well, I've never had a student with this high an IQ. So I'm like, excuse me, so you're going to put her in with the regular classroom because she's too gifted for the gifted? Tell me about the logic on this. Because at least the gifted would be a little more challenging than the regular classroom. She'd be less bored. But she's extremely bored in school. I saw her one summer reading encyclopedias. And then another summer I saw her reading dictionaries. I was like, oh, for God. 5th grade, who reads a dictionary? Even if you're an adult, you know, she's amazing. I have, just watching her, I'm like, But her father's also really smart. So she's gifted with words, but she hasn't really, she's doing flute. I buy her sketchbooks. She's filled 7 sketchbooks. She won't let me see anything she draws, but she is obviously producing. Mm-hmm. And I keep telling her, do not use me as an example, because I have a lifetime of experience as an artist, and there's no way at 14 that you're going to have the skill level that I have. So do not set yourself up against what I can do now as the yardstick for what you think you should be able to do at 14. That's just, you know, I look at that and I think, oh my gosh, I hope she's not going to be setting goals for herself that are unrealistic for her age. Mm-hmm. Because it is a skill acquisition. It does take time. So, okay.
Okay. Well, I think I have actually I have 2 questions still left for you. One was just sort of based off of something that you told me earlier. And I'm involved with a couple of faculty members who are looking at designing a crossover course. Right now it's a mammologist in the art department, but they're interested in sort of combining, you know, their areas to come up with a course in scientific illustration.
Oh, yeah.
And so, which I think is a great idea.
I do too.
And I'm just curious what kind of advice you would give to them about the things that you think should be covered in a class like that.
Well, I think coming at it, as I said a little bit earlier, I think coming at it from a science base is easier than going at it from the art into the science. So if you've got students that are interested in reducing the imagery that you're looking at in the classroom, say you've got a photograph or you're working in the field or whatever, to a line drawing or a pencil or even a painting, you need to focus on the dimensionality. You obviously want to learn the structures, because if it's going to be a scientific illustration, I don't have a lot of experience with zoology, so I can't speak. The image that comes to mind is, okay, say you're looking at a bear. The first thing I'm going to see with the bear, the claws and the fur and, the features, I'm going to look at the dimensional, but I don't know the science behind that. So they would still need to teach the students. They would have to look at it from a morphological point of view. What muscle groups? How does he look when he's standing? How does he look when he's running? How does he look when he's sleeping? How does he look when he's eating? And what is important as representative imagery for that science? In other words, do you want to know all of that? Or do you want to just limit it to just a basic, the bear standing there, side view, front view, Because but you have to focus on the science, and you have to look at it from a strictly structural standpoint. You can't get into what the bear eats or anything like that unless you want to draw him eating, and then that's just very incidental to the picture. It's not the main part. And then you go in and you bring in an artist who does what I do, who can look at this and describe it visually through the steps of the process. Now, if I were to harken back to, or refer back visually to what I do with plants, I'm looking at the basic overall structure first. I guess with a bear, you'd look at the proportions and the shape. And then once you get the structure down, and that's reasonably accurate, and you've got to work on perspectives, and because with anything that you illustrate, you have to have three-dimensionality to it. So you have to learn perspectives. Once you get that basic sketch down, then you have to look at, what makes the bear? The hair, the look of the eyes. You need to layer in the technique. You need to teach the technique for creating dimension. So the science has to begin with what makes a bear, and then the art has to come in. Well, how do you make a bear look like a bear on a two-dimensional medium? So it has to be twofold. You have to start, I believe, with the science and then add the artistic skill later. And you would almost need to have someone who was good in zoological illustrations to begin to liaison with the scientists so that they could develop the technique of interpretation from the science to the art and back and forth. It's like you need to make a circle. Mm-hmm. Having never done it and ultimately never really even conceived of it, because usually when I'm working with someone, they don't want to know the science. They just want me to teach them the art. Oh, that's so pretty. Could you teach me to draw? Well, okay, I can teach you technique, but the science, if you're not going to be doing the science, it's a lot of work. So, I'm used to working at it from the art end, but I really do think the science is the more important end of it. So I would be better doing a course in botanicals, obviously, because I know the material, the science end of it.
Right, and I think it's just that someone in the zoo department was the one that approached the person in the art department, and we have a lot of biological specimens in a museum collection that we administer. The collection's no longer viewable, but it would be a great way to make some of those specimens available to students. You mean
like stuffed animals or bones or
like stuffed, professionally taxidermically prepared animals.
Right. Well,
and native to this area.
Yeah, in that case, you've already got a static image. You're not even having to conceive it. You're just essentially interpreting what's there, which is much easier. I mean, the process that makes botanical illustration so complicated from my perspective is working from pressed specimens that you then have to conceive to three-dimensional nature. With that, it's just a strictly... with that, it becomes straight artistic training at that point. It is beginning drawing classes where they're going to start, we're going to start you with a pile of cubes. And how do you shade these surfaces, and how do you get the perspectives correct and train yourself in basic shape, three-dimensional shape reproduction, and then you just advance through that. So I don't see in a case like that where you would really have to worry that much about the science end of it, because it would be more of a...
Right. Well, that's just one of the sets of objects from which people could work. I don't
Right,
know.
right. I actually sort of mentally went right to like say bones that you wouldn't necessarily
Oh,
want
okay.
people to be handling because skin oils and exposure to
Right.
air and they can really be damaged. And so yeah, you get one person in there in a controlled situation where they can draw the bone and then you don't need the bone anymore because you've got the drawing of the bone. And in a lot of cases, as you'll see when you look at that presentation, pay particular attention to the slide that I do of the sandburr. Because the photograph that I provide, though accurate, is not as good as the illustration. I set them right next to each other on the PowerPoint so that you could see why the illustration was actually better than the photograph. Because you can see more at a glance with the illustration. So in that case, yeah, having your collections reduced to imagery would be very helpful. Protect the collection, plus, they're still available for viewing. And depending on the level of accuracy, they would be able to identify which bone using the illustration. If you get someone who really, like me, who's just, incredibly into every last little line and groove and bump and knob. And
So is there anything that you wish that I had asked you that I didn't?
No, I found your questions very thorough, actually. You obviously put a lot of thought into this. I'm surprised. A lot of lay people that look at my work will ask me, well, why do we even need illustrations? I get that question all the time. And can't we just use photographs? Photographs are great. And in my presentation, I talk about why illustration is so much more valuable than a photograph in terms of the scientific value of the image. Photographs are great. They really are. You can get context and, something. Okay, so you look at my illustration, you're not going to see where it's growing. You're not going to see what color it is. You're not going to see what's growing with it, that's its competition. Those kinds of things can be gleaned from photographs. And they are necessary because you really can't illustrate something like that because it gets lost in the amount of detail that it would have to contain. It really does. I've tried. Some people have said, well, can you draw like a field with, some of these and some of those and some of these? And I'm like, yes, I can. But the detail is going to be sparse because in order to include all of that, if I can't put in the kind of detail because it'll just black out. So I see value to photographs, but as far as a teaching tool, they're not as good as an illustration. I think really ultimately the best publication has both. So you can see it in the habitat, you see the habit of the plant, which is actually how it's growing, and in its habitat with its competing species. Whether it's growing on a sandbank or in the bottom of a river or on a hillside or whatever, the amount of light that it has, those kinds of things are interesting. And then, of course, seeing what makes that plant taxonomically that plant. So to me, that's the best kind of book. I always try to get wrong. Put photos in. Have the illustration here, and then a photo over here off to the corner so they can see what color it is, And ultimately, I always wanted to. And what breaks my heart ultimately, the last and final thing, and we can probably end. Before I had to quit, Ron and I were actually planning on doing a color version of the Field Guide to Oklahoma Plants. And I'm just not going to be able to do it physically. The precision that hand tipping takes is on par with the illustrations themselves because I have to sit and I have to control the paint within those lines. And I have to have a special paper to have those ink illustrations printed on so that I can paint them. Imagine, if you will, me running it on copy paper. You put the watercolor on there and you get bubble, and then the paint runs to the side and you've got a mess. So I have to have them printed on special paper in order to hand tip them, which the process for hand tipping is arduous. So I'm kind of bummed. But again, I look at it like, well, a lot of artists never even create 2,000 pieces of work. So glass is half full here. I'm very pleased,
Okay. Well, thank you so much for spending this time.
Sure.
I'm going to turn our recording equipment off.
Okay.